privilege for us to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Anthony Levatino and Cecile Levatino. They are sought-after international speakers, and we are grateful to have them here today to share their story with us.
Thank you all for being here. How many people are at a pro-life function for the first time? Raise your hands. Quite a few of you. Welcome. We're glad you're here. The story we're about to tell you is not an easy one to tell, and it's not an easy one to hear, but I promise you that everything we're telling you is firsthand and true. I want you to imagine for a minute that you're an obstetrician gynecologist like me. And I want to imagine for a minute that you are a pro-choice obstetrician gynecologist like I used to be. Your patient today is 17 years old. She's 20 weeks pregnant. Her uterus is all the way up to her umbilicus. If you could see her baby, and that's easy on an ultrasound, that baby would be the length of your hand, from the tip of your middle finger to your wrist. That's a 20-week baby, head to rump, not counting the legs. She's been feeling her baby kick for the last 2 weeks, but now she's asleep on an operating room table and you're there to help her with her problem. You walk into the operating room scrubbed and gowned, and the first thing you reach for is a suction catheter. It's about 11 inches long, clear plastic. Picture yourself putting this up through the cervix into the uterus and then turning on and instruct your circulating nurse to turn on the suction machine. And what you'll see is pale yellow fluid running through the tubing into the machine. That was the amniotic fluid that was there to protect the baby. Now, if she were 12 weeks pregnant or less, a 12-week baby is the width of your hand, head to rump, you could pretty much do the whole abortion with this one instrument. Babies this big do not fit through catheters this size. So you put that down and you reach for your Sofer clamp. It's about 13 inches long, it's stainless steel. The business end is about 2.5 inches long and 1/2 inch wide with rows of sharp teeth. This is a grasping instrument, and when it gets a hold of something, it does not let go. A suction D&E abortion, the way I used to do them, was a blind procedure. You don't see anything, you do everything by feel. So picture yourself putting this instrument up to the cervix. Be very careful not to perforate the wall of the uterus, and blindly grab anything you can and pull. And I do mean hard, and out pops a leg about that big, which you put down on the table next to you. Reach in again, grasp, pull, hard. Out comes an arm about the same length, which you put down on the table. And reach in with the same instrument again and again, and tear out the spine, the intestines, the heart, and lungs. Head on a baby that size is about the size of a plum. Can't see it, but pretty sure you've got it if you've got a hold of something and your fingers are spread as far as they go. You know you did it right if you crush down on the instrument and white material runs out of the cervix. That was the baby's brains. Now you can pull out skull pieces. Sometimes a little face comes back and stares back at you. Congratulations. You just successfully performed a second trimester D&E abortion. You just affirmed her right to choose. You just made, in today's dollars, $2,200 legally in 15 minutes. Now, I graduated from medical school in 1976, and if you asked me at the time how I felt about the abortion issue, I would not have hesitated for a second to tell you I was pro-choice. This was a decision between a doctor, that woman, and no one, including the baby's father, had anything to say about it. You know, a lot of people identify themselves as pro-life or pro-choice. For a lot of people, it doesn't directly affect their lives. But when you're an obstetrician gynecologist and you say you're pro-choice, this isn't just some vague political position. You have to decide whether you're going to actually learn to do those procedures. So in my residency program, right along with learning how to do deliveries and hysterectomies and all the things that obstetrician gynecologists do, I learned to do abortions. We had a clinic that met in the hospital twice a week, and we did both first and second trimester abortions in that clinic. If patients were 13 weeks from their last period or less, we'd book them for suction D&C abortions. And believe it or not, we used to do them in the delivery room. And when it was my turn to do them, I would do 2, 3, 4 in the morning, never thought anything of it. If they were more than 13 weeks pregnant, we would make them wait a few weeks and they would come back for saline abortions. These aren't done anymore, but suffice it to say that these women had to go through labor. It would take them 8 to 36 hours for them to deliver their usually dead children. But hey, I was pro-choice and I was there to learn my trade. And every doctor, abortionist or not, wants the same thing: happy, healthy patients. It was during my first year of training that I was working at night, went down to the cafeteria for a break, and an attractive young nurse came and sat down next to me, and she's standing right here.
And that was 40 years ago. New York had the dubious distinction of legalizing abortion 3 years prior to Roe versus Wade. So in 1970, abortion became legal in New York. And a couple of years later, I'm going through my nurse's training and getting ready to do my obstetrics rotation when our instructor came to us and said, "You as nursing students have a choice to make." Odd choice of words. You need to decide whether you want to learn how to assist the physicians in doing abortions or not. And there was only one other nursing student besides myself who said, "No, not interested in that." And I went on, graduated, and as was said earlier, majored and helped start the renal transplant team at the University Medical Center I was at. And that was the end of it until 1976, when Tony was doing his surgical residency on my surgical floor, and that's how we met, and started dating, and learned very quickly that we were on opposite sides of this issue. But instead of addressing that and dealing with it and talking it through, we started what started to be a very negative pattern in our marriage. We didn't discuss the important things. He didn't discuss what he was doing during the day, and as far as I was concerned, abortion was not part of our life. We got married, and at the time we were in our late 20s, and we thought, we're really old, we need to start a family, and started trying to have a family of our own. He came from a large Italian family, I came from a large Irish family. Having kids was just a natural part of what you did when you got married. But we found out very soon that we weren't getting pregnant. Started seeing the top infertility specialist in Albany, and learned very quickly that it was going to be a process. And I can remember so vividly going through the tests and the surgeries and the drugs and everything else, and nothing was happening. And I would come home from those doctor's visits, and I remember specifically turning on the TV one day and watching literally a cat food commercial and seeing these sweet little kittens and just bursting into tears. And it wasn't lost on me, the irony, that here I am married to an OBGYN who's killing babies, and we can't get pregnant. We went through all the process with the infertility specialist, and at one point he said, there's one more surgical procedure we can do. It'll only take about an hour and a half. When he walked out of the operating room 3.5 hours later, he looked at Tony and he said, I never say never, but don't plan on having the child of your own. We were devastated. We want a family, but we thought, okay, if we can't have a child of our own, we will adopt. We learned very quickly that was much harder than we thought. There was literally, we called county agencies, state agencies, religious agencies, anybody we could think of. And the best we could do was get on a 5-year waiting list to get on the real waiting list. Tony had a brilliant idea one night, and he said, I'm on a first name basis with 52 OBGYNs in town. Why don't we just advertise? Why don't we let them know that we're looking for a baby to adopt? And that's exactly what we did.
I told you earlier that I didn't think twice about doing abortions. I was dedicated. But it was during this time when we were trying to adopt a child of our own that I had the first doubts. They were strictly selfish. But, you know, here we are being frustrated, as Cecile said, trawling everyone we could and reaching one brick wall after another. And I remember very vividly doing abortions during that time and thinking, gosh, I'm just throwing these kids in the garbage. Wouldn't even one of these women allow us to take this child home and care for her as our own? But of course it doesn't work that way. But the advertising idea was a good one. And in August of 1978, I was working in the operating room with an attending physician, and the circulating nurse tapped me on the shoulder. And when I turned around, she was holding up a piece of paper that said, "Call Marcia as soon as you're done." Now, Marcia was the head of social services at Albany Medical Center. She's one of the people we had talked to. That's all the note said, but I knew what it meant. And sure enough, when I called her, she informed me there was a 15-year-old girl in labor in the delivery room. She'd had no prenatal care. First time she ever saw a doctor was the day before. But now she's in labor, she looks healthy, the baby's doing well, she wants to give her baby up for adoption. Are you interested? Well, of course I was interested. I remember staring at the face of the telephone to call my wife at the snooze and know that I was just 7 digits away from becoming a father. And literally, by the grace of God, we were able to adopt a little girl that we named Heather in August of 1978. Fantastic, we finally have a baby. And after all the years, and after all the tears, and after all the doubts, we had a baby of our own, and my wife got pregnant the very next month. And our son Sean was born in July 1979, just 10 months later. Now, Heather and Sean were figuratively and literally close. Anyone that didn't know that Heather had been adopted would look at the two of them and go, 10 months apart? Man, you didn't give your wife much of a break, did you? But hey, I've got the proverbial millionaire's family. I've got a son and a daughter now. And any doubts I had about abortion simply evaporated, and I went back to business as usual. I graduated from my residency program in 1980. We moved to the west coast of Florida. Figured out fairly quickly that a young family with 2 young kids didn't belong in a retirement community. We laugh at that now. And we moved back to upstate New York, and I set up practice in Troy, New York, right next to Albany, with a physician that I had trained with. Now, Bill and I were practiced abortionists. We were not running an abortion clinic. This was just a routine OBGYN office like most women in this room have been to. We did everything, deliveries, hysterectomies, we did everything, but abortion was part of our practice. And in 1981, when we got together, at the time, those of us in the abortion industry were looking for a better method of second trimester abortion, the later ones. The saline abortions we've been doing up to then, as I mentioned earlier, women had to go through labor. It was incredibly difficult on patients, it was difficult on staff, it was a dangerous procedure, it was expensive because of the prolonged hospital stays. We wanted a method of second trimester abortion like first trimester, where the patient would go to sleep and when she woke up it would all be over. And that's when suction D&E abortions were being developed. Although there were many, many obstetrician gynecologists in Albany who would do abortions, no one wanted to touch that procedure, and we saw an opportunity. So we trained ourselves to do these second trimester D&E abortions, and we were beginning to get referrals from other physicians to do that procedure. Over the next 4 years, I did 1,200 abortions. Over 100 were the late-term abortions that I talked about earlier. But hey, life's good. Kids are growing, we're finally making some money, we can afford a home, we can afford some furniture, and life was just lovely until June 23rd, 1984. June 23rd was a beautiful day, it was a Saturday. I was on call, but it wasn't very busy. I made rounds in the morning, we took the kids to an amusement park that afternoon, we had dinner together, and that evening we were talking with friends who came over for cake and coffee when the kids were playing in the backyard. And at 7:25 that night, we heard the screech of brakes out in front of the house. Kids had gone on the road. Heather had been hit by a car. She was a mess. We ran out and did everything we could. I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to be able to save people's lives. My wife was an intensive care nurse. This was our work. We did everything we could, and it made absolutely no difference. And she literally died in our arms in the back of an ambulance that night. If you have kids, you may think you have some idea of what that would be like. If you haven't been through this yourself, trust me, you have no idea at all. I hope you never find out. But what do you do after a disaster? You bury your child, You take some time off, and then you try to get back into your life. And I don't know exactly how long it was after Heather's death, but I showed up at OR number 9 at Albany Medical Center, just like I had over 100 times before, for a second trimester D&E abortion. I wasn't thinking of this as anything special, it was routine. I had other things on my mind. And I started that procedure, and I reached in with that Sofer clamp, and I tore out an arm or a leg, and I got sick. Earlier, I told you about stacking up body parts on the side of the table. That's not to gross out the people that came to the lunch. When you do an abortion, you have to keep inventory. You have to make sure that you get 2 arms, 2 legs, and all the pieces. Because if you don't, your patient will come back infected, bleeding, or dead. So I finished that procedure. And I know it sounds strange, but I promised you earlier that everything we're telling you is firsthand and true. For the first time in my career, after all those years and all those abortions, I looked. I really looked at that pile of body parts on the side of the table. And I didn't see her wonderful right to choose. And I didn't see what a great doctor I was helping her with her problem. And I didn't even see the over $2,000 I just made in 15 minutes. All I could see was somebody's son or daughter. And it occurred to me in that moment that this patient had come to me, figuratively, never literally, and said, here's $2,000, kill my son or daughter. And I was the kind of physician who would look her straight in the eye with no compunction at all, say, sure, I'll do that.
Well, needless to say, we were going through a pretty tough time. And after Heather died, I always knew when he was on for the next day's abortions. He was miserable to our friends, our family. He got into a blame game. It was the girl's fault for getting pregnant. It was the nurse's fault for scheduling on his day. It was the hospital's fault for letting them be done. And this went on for a while. And it literally got to the point where I didn't think our marriage, I didn't think there was anything left of our marriage. And one night I literally had the suitcases packed for me and Sean, our son. And he started into one of his rages. And I looked at him, I said, you know, it's not the girl's fault, it's not the nurse's fault, it's not the hospital's fault. If this is bothering you so much, why don't you just quit?
Husbands and wives tend to remember things differently. Your house too, huh? But the words I remembered were, you stupid idiot, if this is bothering yourself, so why don't you just quit?
I confess.
Yeah. But Seal had broken our unspoken rule, and that was the opening salvo in what turned into a 2-hour conversation about what had been going on. Now, I'm glad to say she didn't leave, but I went to my partners the next day and told them that I would no longer do any more second trimester D&E abortions. It was just too difficult. I would just do the little ones, the suction D&C abortions we were doing in the office, and for several months I soldiered on doing those. But a change had occurred that I could not take back. I know that so many people look up to physicians. We think we're so smart. We're no different than anyone else. When you finally figure out, here, not here, that killing a baby this big for money is wrong, it doesn't take you too long to figure out that it doesn't matter if the baby is this big or maybe even this big. It's all the same. And it was in February of 1985 that I finally went to my partners a second time and said that I would no longer do any more abortions, and I never did another one after that. I tell, and especially when we get an opportunity to speak in front of college students or high school students, rarely, it's so easy to decide what happens to someone else's life. But the reality is, today you're an adult. Once you were a child, you didn't look anything like you look today. Once you were a baby, Once you were this big, but it was always you. 1983, I'm still doing abortions on a regular basis. And something happened that no abortionist wants to see. I arrive at my office and we're being picketed by the local Christian crazies. They didn't have our names on the signs, but we knew they were there for us. And people ask all the time, what's it like when we're outside picketing your office? I said, I'll tell you what it's like. It gives you a siege mentality. It's us against you kooks outside. But I got a new patient at the time. Her name was Susan, didn't even come up to my shoulders. She was in her mid-30s. She came in for a routine GYN exam and a pap smear, nothing special. And when it was over, the lady looks at me and she says, can I talk to you? And doctors in the audience know that frequently patients, and I think especially female patients, won't tell you what's really on their mind until they've developed some level of trust. So this wasn't all that unusual. I sat the lady down and looked at her and across my desk and very professionally looked at her and said, how can I help you? And the lady blew me away when she said, I've been sent here to give you a message that Jesus loves you. He cares about you. This is not what he had intended for your life to be an abortionist. Please stop. Whoa. Okay, no patient had ever spoken to me that way. And believe me, doctors listen to their patients. And understand, it's not like my wife and I never darkened the inside of a church before, but people who were demonstrative about their faith always made me uncomfortable. And I had one overwhelming thought when she said this, and that was, I got to hustle this kook out of my office as fast as I could, and I did. A year later, she showed up again for her GYN exam and a pap smear, and she said, can I talk to you? And I went, oh, no. And she said it again, almost the exact words. I've been sent here to give you a message that Jesus loves you. He cares about you. This is not what he had intended for your life to be an abortionist. Please stop. Now remember, I remembered what she had said the year before, believe me. But in the intervening year between those two visits, I received at least 3 personal greeting cards mailed to my office, marked confidential, to me with that message written on the greeting card. One time during the intervening year, I arrived at my office and there was a plate of brownies on my desk with the message tied to the brownies. How long would you evangelize someone who thought you were nuts? I mean, she was not stupid. She kept her one-woman war up for 7 years.
Back in New York, there was, and this is kind of an example of the power of prayer. And I really encourage you all to pray. We wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for people praying for us for years. There was a woman in Albany who was very involved in the pro-life movement, and she was a jack of all trades. She would go into New York State Right to Life and she'd answer the phone, she'd stuff envelopes, she would do whatever needed to be done. But one of the things that she loved to do was go into the parochial and private schools where she was allowed and do a pro-life presentation to the junior high kids. And one day she woke up, she was scheduled to go into one of the schools, and she really felt very ill, tried to find someone else to take her place and couldn't. So she dragged herself out of bed and she went into that school. She gave her presentation, and that night, one of the little girls that was in her class that day was sitting at her kitchen table having dinner with her family, and her parents asked her the same question that we've all asked our kids a million times: what happened in school today? And this little girl proceeded to tell her parents about this woman who came in and did a pro-life presentation. One of the things that this woman had done for years was pray for a specific OBGYN abortionist in Albany. But she not only prayed for the abortionist, she prayed for the abortionist's wife and children. That little girl proceeded to tell her parents that night about this woman coming into her class. Unbeknownst to her, God had put her in front of that child that she had been praying for years. God had put her in front of that child whose dad was the abortionist who she had been praying for years. Her daddy was so afraid that his little girl was going to find out We need to be praying not only for the young women and young men that are walking through those doors. You need to be praying for the people that are inside those doors working. Sincerely and honestly praying for them. God honors our prayers. You may not know on this side of heaven how successful you were, but God will honor those prayers. Back in the late 1990s, Planned Parenthood started a national program paying third-year medical students $1,000 to spend a few weeks in their clinics. They couldn't do any surgery, they couldn't kill any babies, but that wasn't the point. The point was to desensitize them. The point was to get them in there and have them observing. So they would be desensitized so that when they graduated, they'd be ready to start killing babies. Dr. Dobson, James Dobson, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dr. Dobson and Focus on the Family, was very concerned about this and wanted to start medical students for life organizations on the medical campuses around the country, and asked if I would take over that position and do that, which I joyfully did. At the time, there were 110 medical schools in this country, and by the time I left that position, we had medical students for life organizations on 80 of those 110 campuses. One of those years, there's an organization, and what's it called, hon? ACGME, which is the medical organization of medical professors, the doctors who teach the medical students. And they were having an annual conference down at Disney World in Florida. And I was going down. They had a big auditorium where medical supply companies and everybody had their exhibits. And I was going down and setting up a pro-life exhibit. And I got a call from Focus on the Family and said, would you take this young girl with you from Washington State who's being trained to be an executive director of a crisis pregnancy center? I said, sure. So she came along with me, and for 3 days we were in the room with our pro-life display. And God has he's so cool. We were literally at the junction of a T. So any of the doctors that were coming into that room had to walk past the pro-life exhibit to get anywhere else. And it was fascinating to watch them either turn themselves into pretzels trying to avoid us, or coming over and whispering, I'm with you. And it's like, why are you whispering? Speak up. Anyway, at the end of the 3 days, we're breaking down our exhibit to leave. And this female doctor literally came charging at us. And she's tearing off her name tag as she's yelling at me. Now, this is pre-9/11. She's accusing me of being a terrorist, that I had no business being there, that I was on the wrong side of the issue. And every time I tried to interject and say something, she would just scream louder. And it really was a Holy Spirit moment. It was like, duh. And I thought, this woman has had an abortion. And now she's teaching other doctors how to do this to justify what she did to her child. And I very gently laid my hand on her arm, and I looked her in the eye, and I said, I am so sorry you're in so much pain. She stopped screaming. Tears started to run down her face. And as she turned on her heel and literally started to run away from me, she's yelling over her shoulder, I'm not in pain. I'm not in pain. And I looked at the young woman with me and I said, we need to pray. And we literally stood in front of all these people and started praying. Here's my point. When the pro-abortionists start screaming at you, remember this one truth. The ones who scream the loudest are the ones who are hurting the most. They don't hate you. They hate what they did to themselves. Have mercy on them. Understand, it's not personal. It's about them, and they are hurting, and they're hurting bad.
I left my practice in 1990. That was the time I went to law school. There was a lot of things going on in that practice, and as I said earlier, you know, my partners were very understanding when I stopped doing abortions. They knew what was going on. That was okay. But when Cecile and I got involved in the pro-life movement, subsequently, this was not cool. This was not good. We lost every friend that we had. Phones stopped ringing, the invitations dried up. But God was very good to us, even though we didn't appreciate what was going on at the time. And he just filled the void in with pro-life friends, pro-life Christian friends, who became a model for us of what it was to live a Christian life. And there were a lot of people that he put in front of us. I could tell 100 stories that we don't have time for, but I always tell one. I left the practice in 1990. A couple months later, I crossed over the state line into Vermont on a Saturday morning to give a presentation in a high school gymnasium. Maybe 50 people showed up. And I gave a pro-life presentation. And this woman came up to me, very short, in her 70s, very gracious, chattering away at high speed. "Oh, thank you so much for coming and giving us a presentation. And isn't it beautiful what Jesus is doing in your life?" And I go, "Oh God, another one." And I felt like a fraud. I didn't want this lady to think I was something that I wasn't. So I looked at her and like an idiot, stemmed and stammered, said, "Well, ma'am, I don't feel about Jesus the way you do." I'll never forget. She stopped chattering, looked up, got a big smile on her face. She said, "He knows you, sweetie. He's going to get you sooner or later." And she walked away. And he did, a very short time after that. The minister who brought us the last little bit of that journey didn't know any of this. He was just an experienced minister. I know, dear. And he said, "You know, in my experience, a lot of people help you on the road to God. Wouldn't it be nice to go, to go out and thank some of them?" And the first woman I thought of was Susan. I told you earlier, she'd been keeping up on her one-woman war for 7 years at that point. So I invited her out to lunch, and I found out something that I did not know before. She was one of those people picketing my office in 1983. And I would have never understood it then, but I understood now when she said, "You know, I can't explain it, but I felt strongly called to go to you specifically as a physician and give you that message. I fought it because I did not want to patronize an abortionist, but I did it because I felt that I was supposed to do it," and she did. Every one of you has tremendous power. Every one of you can have a real influence on what's going on. It may be in the next few months that Roe versus Wade is overturned. Pro-life organizations like Council for Life only become more important. Abortion is not illegal if Roe v. Wade goes down. Abortion becomes a state-by-state battle. And the next one, and one of the greatest states in that battle, is Texas. Thank you. But the next battlefield is going to be mail-order abortion pills coming over your border in unmarked envelopes to your citizens. And that's why organizations like Council for Life are so important. This is a fundraiser. They're here to raise $100,000. We've been in a lot of rooms this size and bigger. $100,000 is nothing for a room this size. So when they come to you, be generous, support their work, become an associate member of Council for Life, because every one of us needs to fight this battle. God bless you all, and thank you.